Hello everyone, this is from KRGraphics, and I'm here with a new video. And this is a presentation of a skin shader that I've been working on inside of Unity for my projects. A lot of people asked about this, and I'm here to just demonstrate it for you. So what you're seeing here is a character I worked on last year, and I've been using it for shader development. And today, I'll be demonstrating to you how I go about creating the skin shaders for this particular character. This is a multi-use skin shader for all different characters of different skin tones and races. As in any production or environment, this is a work in progress. So let's begin by talking about the three texture slots on the top row here for skin textures. Now, you're familiar with renderers like Arnold, Mentor-Ray, V-Ray, or software programs like Marmoset Toolbag. These will be familiar to you. So the first slot is the dermis, which is the outermost layers of skin. Now, on human skin, there are several layers of skin. There's dermal, epidermal, and subdermal. And in this shader, I've put it together to ensure that I have the same output of different materials. So the dermis is the topmost layer, and upon authoring it, it's not very interesting, especially since it's almost featureless. You know, if you have programs like Substance Painter, you can actually paint the textures at the same time. So this one is a very desaturated, almost gray-looking texture, and you have, your hair, your follicles, freckles, and it's pretty much everything you see on a human skin. Now the layer below this is the epidermis, and with this one, this is the main color texture you see in the character before you. And in this shader, I have hair follicles, freckles, skin pore cavities, bruises, even makeup on this layer. Now, on this character, there's no makeup, but in the future, of course, I can show how that would be done. And this is the one you see the most inside of most people. And in the alpha channel, this is a subsurface mask, which is a very simple texture. I can go ahead and click it for you. So I pick this. There we go. So I pick this here. This is the epidermis. It's the base color, but it's known as the epidermis. And this is the normal skin tone of the character. So if you're painting this in Substance Painter, this would be your main color you pick. And the alpha channel, well, it's nothing now. I think I didn't say this out, but normally, of course, in this channel, you would have your skin textures, you would have the pot marks and hair. And I'm glad I caught this, so I'm gonna go home and back and fix it. Okay, so the next one up is the subdermis, and this is based off of this texture, which is, aside from this, is a small hue change and increased saturation. And this texture will contain these like tattoos. And by the way, too, you can have tattoos in the epidermal layer, but a little subdued. This represents the deeper layer of the skin, the fatty tissue, the deep muscle, things like veins. And also, of course, if you were get into a fight, you can see bruises come from below the skin. This one is pretty important. It does add color to the character's skin. And in this layer is the transmission map, which will determine how light will pass through the character's skin. Now, you bake this in Substance Painter, is also known as a thickness map, whereas black is no transmission, and white, well, up to white is full transmission. Now, my setup here, I have everything else is dark except the ears, which I will show you in a minute. And in the shade, of course, it is all driven by sliders and multipliers. Now, this slider here is called scatter intensity, and it ties into the alpha channel of the subsurface mask. So if I go close here, and I go close. All right. So I go ahead now and set this to 0. You may not notice it immediately, but the skin got really crunchy and rough. Let me do that again for you. So I do that. And of course, if I don't have faster hardware, you'll see it more quickly. So there we go. So right up here, this is where it gets very soft, where it scatters the skin. It also ties into the diffusion profile. So let's hit 0 again. Notice how it got very crunchy. And this is the top half of the skin texture. Now the next section are the weighting values. And each of these sliders will tie into each of these 3 channels. So if I turn them down to 0, you notice how the character's skin gets very dark. Now the dermis intensity, I have that as a minimum of 0.2. Otherwise, the character will turn black. We have no color, which isn't realistic, but in a 3D program, this is how I debug my materials. So if I turn up the dermis intensity to 1, it'll reveal the dermis map. And like I said, it is very muted. There's no color information. And all you see here is the eyebrows, hair, very subdued skin pores, which I've chosen for artistic sake. Okay, and all of this in here is what you see on top of the skin if it was devoid of blood flow. If, for example, like a cadaver. And I'll admit too, if you were doing a zombie character, this would be perfect for that. Alright, let's figure it to 0. Okay, next one is going to be epidermis, and this is the main base color. Also, these sliders you use this as a debug, so that I can see where adding hair, tattoos, just to see how things look blend together. Now, of course, you could be asking yourself, well, why do you just do one texture? Well, I wanted more creative control, and I also wanted to see how realistic I can make the skin on the character this way. So set it down to 0. And the subdermis intensity. This is the same texture as the epidermis, but just highly saturated. And depending on the race of your character or the skin color, these colors will differ. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have Substance Painter, you can do all these maps at the same time, just by setting a layer stack, such as with sliders sort of saturation, and have it affect the channels. All right, now you're probably noticing these numbers in the side here, and why I deliberately didn't set them the way they were earlier. So if I put this all to 1, what happened now is the skin will be overblown. And that's because in the shader set, I have these sliders set to add to one another. Now, in an actual skin shader, all these values must add to 1. You shouldn't exceed any of this. So, example, let's set the dermis visibility intensity to 0.25, and set the epidermis to 0.4. And if you're doing math right now, this is equal to 65. Okay, and set the epidermis to 35. And now, of course, now you have full skin. That's pretty cool, huh? Alright, so now this part's all taken care of, let's go to the molten material. And actually, before I do anything here, I'm having some performance issues. So give me 1 second. Yeah, because that's the wonderful thing about creating high fidelity content. You need to have some seriously good hardware to take advantage of it all. And let's go ahead and set the medium quality for now. Let's give it a second here. Okay, good. Let's give it a second to refresh. All right, there we go. So now a little bit of speed increase here. All right, so aside from that, now let's go to the next layer, which is the multi-material section. Now, this material map here, I used to have an asset for Unity called Alloy. And with Alloy, you would work with a pack texture, which is basically taking 3 different textures and pack them into individual channels. These are all grayscale in Substance Painter. And if I click on it, and I go down here, so what you see here is this very wild looking multicolor texture. And also in your inspector, make sure sRGB is off. These have to be linear. So I have 3 textures. I could have an alpha. This one. Well, actually, I'm mistaken here. This alpha is actually my subsurface mask. So I'm kind of glad I won't do anything. And so if I were to go into Amplify Shader Editor, you would see that this alpha channel represents a scattering mask. I'm glad I found this. So the red channel is the primary roughness, which is an overall roughness of the character's skin. And yes, I'm doing it this way because Amplify Shader Editor doesn't support stack lighting yet, which will make this process so much easier. The next one here is the secondary roughness, and these 2 values are added together to create a nice effect in the skin. I will show that later on in the presentation. And the B channel is blue, which is ambient occlusion. Nothing fancy here. I've added hair, the wrinkles, and all the deep pot marks in the skin because skin pores do not scatter light. Okay, let's go on to the next section. And while I'm here, of course, is Peach Fuzz. Now, if you ever notice on a person, standing next to them, there is like a haze of light on the corners of their face. That's because there's light scattering along the tiny little hairs on the skin. They're called vellus hairs. And I don't have it set up here yet properly, but if I touch this check mark here, you'll notice how the glazing angle here disappears. So if I hit it again, you'll see it's very subtle. You'll notice this when you are near an area like a white wall. You'll see this phenomenon a lot. And on this slider here, I can control how much fuzz I want. This is more for artistic control, and keeping it subtle is important. And speaking of subsurface scattering profile, I have several, and you will need this in my skin shader. So I picked blackmail, and also because I chose this character as well, because in a lot of presentations you don't just see characters of darker skin tones. And so in the shader profile, I have the max radius set down to 8.34. It could be anything you want, but I recommend keeping it as low as possible. The anti-refraction is 1.4, and then the world scale is to 1. Now, when I work on my skin shaders, I often keep the world scale at 1, which is as realistic as possible. If I would set this down to like 0.5 or something like that, it'll look weird. You won't see it here, but on lighter characters, you will definitely see this effect. So, let's turn it back. And of course, texture node is pre and post scatter, which as I mentioned, because this character was made in ZBrush, there are no scans in the character. You would change this to post scatter if you were bringing in a 3D skin. So let's go back to the skin. And now the next one now is we discuss transmission. And you see these two sliders? This is transmission minimum and maximum. And they are lurked between each other. Now to demonstrate this, I'm going to go ahead and move the directional light behind the character. So let's go ahead and move this here. There. Alright, so let's turn off the light for a minute. So the light off, you'll still notice that there's some transmission working here. That's because I found out recently that if you're working with the HDRP or the high def pipeline, if you go to your light and sky and fog volume that I have set up here, you turn the volume off, it turns off all the lights in the scene. That's because if you're using glow illumination, your sky map will influence your character, including transmission. It's very subtle here, and that required a lot of tweaking on my end. Alright, so let's go ahead and now turn on directional light back on and see what it does. So you notice here with the sunlight behind the character, you see there's a little glow behind his ears. That's because the transmission map is because in the shader I have the very low end and higher end of the transmission map. Now, when I baked this in Substance Painter, I baked this using floating point values. If I set the minimum to 0 right now, what will happen is it'll literally read that transmission map as full scatter, which is nice and all, but the effect could be a little more subtle. And if I set to 1, well, you get very little effect. But I had this here as more of a control for art control. So let's go to if I set that really high, that's crazy high. See that there? It's like a piece of metal glowing in the dark. It's a little high there. Set this 8, and what happens here now is using the highs and lows of the transmission map. So set this to negative 0.2.6. Now the thinner spots are showing more transmission, and the thicker parts are not. It also ties in to the profile I showed you earlier, where I have to remap the values between 1 and 3. That's pretty realistic. And also the color transmission will change based on the race of your character, or you have the color change inside of the profile. Now the next one's important. It's normal mapping. Let's put the light back where it was, because I need to see what this. Let's go back. Okay, good. Right there is good. Okay, so let's go back now and take a look at the normal maps. Now in this shader, there's only one normal map, but what I did here is what I ended up doing was taking a normal map and splitting it into three different components. So I now have sliders on the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel. Let's open up the shader editor and I'll show you what I did. Let's give it a second here. Okay, let's see here. Okay, here we go. Let's give it a second. There's one thing I've been noticing on this old hardware is although it works very well, waiting for UI windows to pop up. It's one thing I don't like about this version of Unity, having to wait for editors to show up. Okay, so now that I'm here, alright, so let's go here in the shader, and I'll show you the normal map. So the way this is set up is this is my base normal map. This is the main normal map using the character. Okay, and I've gone ahead and created 3 texture references to this node, which means instead of using 3 separate normal maps on the same texture, I can just reference 1 with no performance hit. And each of these floats will control the strength of the normal map and the bias which essentially blurs normal map per channel. And then I take these references and feed it into an append node, which will combine all the channels together with the new values I've applied. So let's go here now. And this stupid window again. Okay, let's go ahead now and change the values in the map channels, similar to 1. And this is the default is 1, but I like having a little more strength in my normal map. So let's go close. Nice and close to character. So the red channel is usually in a normal map. The red channel is left to right, green up and down, and blue channel is your height or cavities. And I don't have any here, but that's fine. So I'll set this the green channel to 1.5. I mean, I like having a strong normal map. And then we'll set the red channel to 1.25, and then we'll leave the blue channel at 1. There's nothing in it currently. And this is why it's important to have a strong normal map, because in the next channel below is normal map blurring. Now, if you're familiar with some technical papers, they do mention that there is something called diffuse blurring, which essentially blurs a normal map to add more detail, to make the model look softer. So, in my shader, set to 0, and essentially what that does, it basically makes it very crispy again. And while I'm here, let me turn on the shader debug option so you can see it better. This is a gray render. There's nothing fancy about this, but of course this is where you see your models scattering on the surface. If I were to turn this off, it would basically look very crunchy. So let's turn this off, and you notice how it starts scattering again. So let's start blurring the normal maps and see what it does. So the human skin, the color red is the strongest, so we go ahead and we bring it up. Let's hide this, and then the green channel. Let's blur that too. And don't do it too much, otherwise you start losing detail. You won't see it now, but it's look up here on this brow ridge, and you see the detail. It start blurring. And then go to blue channel, do the same thing there. Alright, let's turn it to the right. And if we zoom back a little bit, you'll notice how the skin looks very soft. You know, more detail in it. Looks really cool. And this is how I debug my skin shaders. You know, to get the look of softness. And you see here too, in the gray render, you'll see that scattering map doing its work. Because remember, there's no scattering in skin pores. All right, and let's go to debug options now. We're near the end, and oh, can we do that? All right, so let's go ahead and turn off the gray render, and we'll turn on the debug. Now, I don't normally use this, but I use it just to show people how powerful the shader can be when you set it up. If you use Arnold or other offline renderers, you'll see exactly this. So let's go ahead and work on the skin shader for Bruce Banner at the Hulk. So the dermis color, set to green. And bring it a little brighter too. Yeah, right there. Maybe we do green. Okay, let's go to the epidermis now. Same thing here. And of course, to control the character's skin color, I do the textures, and then I use the sliders afterwards to blend them together. And by the way, too, this base color setup is also tied into weighting layers. So that the best of both worlds, I can tweak the character. So right here, and turn the values a bit. Yeah, that's about good. So this is kind of kind of akin to Hulk or Bruce Banner. And of course, with skin shaders, it's always endless tweaking. And last but not least, I will showcase the dual roughness. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Amplify shader editor doesn't support stack colliding yet, so this is kind of a hack. So these two channels here work together to create an overall roughness in the skin. The primary roughness is an overall value of the skin. So example, let's go ahead now. So it says only one. So turn off the peach fuzz. Okay, what's going on here? Okay, I broke my shader. Okay, yeah. I might have broken my shader inadvertently. Alright, I'll go over for now. We'll pretend it's there. So, the primary roughness is usually a little lower than the secondary roughness. And the way I would paint this is I would paint the primary roughness with all the detail I want. And then in the secondary roughness, it would be a darker map. And I'd paint all of the areas I want brighter, such as the nose bridge, forehead, cheek, lips. And because the nature of the way the shaders are added together, it will have no negative effect. And this is what I want. This is what I want. Create the look of skin. And again, it all depends on the character's ethnicity, how much oil is in the skin, and how young or old they are. And usually, of course, if you're older, there won't be much shine in the skin because with the skin stretched, it looks a little more oily. But that's about it for the shader demonstration. Oh, and one more thing I want to point out: if you're working on characters, resolution does matter. So turn the wire from here, you'll see the character's head mesh is pretty dense. And that's because when I'm working on my characters, I tend on using them for facial animation. And that in itself is pretty important aspect of the development of my characters. So example, like if I'm doing wrinkle maps, having all this here would help. And plus, having a higher resolution will avoid any artifacts that involve transmission. So, anyway guys, that's all I want to talk about today. Hope you guys got something out of this. And feel free to ask questions, whether here on this YouTube video or in any forum. So until next time, you guys take care of yourselves. Have a nice day.